Okay, it is 9:30. Welcome everyone to our presentation on the FEMA Map Basics. Appreciate everyone coming today. I'm Seal Strauss. I'm this Minnesota State Floodplain Manager, and I'll be one of your presenters today. And Mary, wanna
Hi, yep,
introduce
I'm
yourself?
Mary Presnell. I'm a floodplain hydrologist here in the Land Use Programs Unit at the DNR.
Thank you. And we have our coworker Gary Bennett, who will be helping to watch the chat and monitor things for us. So thanks to Gary. And just a few guidelines up front here. We do have everyone muted, but at the end we'll open it up for Q&A, and you'd be able to unmute yourself if you like. As we're talking today, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If they're more immediate things, we'll try and address them as we go. And some of the questions may end up being answered at the end when we open things up for general Q&A. And this presentation will probably go the full hour, but we'll stick around after the hour and answer any questions that folks have if they want to stick around and ask questions. So moving on, talking about FEMA Map Basics. I'll be covering some of the basics and definitions, a few resources on how to find the FEMA maps and see those. Mary will talk about the map updates, and then I'll talk about FEMA map, I'm not supposed to call them map appeals. It's actually the getting letters of map amendments and getting your zone changed officially. And again, we'll have time at the very end for questions, but may not be before 10:30. So a little bit of history of FEMA maps. The National Flood Insurance Program, for those who were listening the other day or have heard us before, it started back in 1968. So basically in the 70s and into the early 80s, it was the emergency program. They were doing quick and dirty maps, so they had something to work with. They were not very detailed. These lines here are the sections. So that's a mile across. You've got the stream, you've got very few roads. So they're really difficult to work with. And unfortunately, some of our counties still have this level of mapping. As time went on, FEMA started doing the more detailed studies. And the first generation, when we were getting those emergency maps converted to the regular program, as they called it, they would have a flood insurance study, a flood insurance rate map, and a flood boundary and floodway map. The flood insurance study would give background, talk about the flooding problems, talk about the engineering methods they used, and for those bigger streams where they got more detailed modeling done, they would have the flood elevations for the 10, 50, 100, and 500-year floods. I mentioned these frequencies. Those were have been the main frequencies that FEMA would look at, although the 100-year is what we use for regulatory purposes. But in terms of mapping data and data that you can use for other purposes, like for instance, the 10 years used often for on-site septic systems or for local stormwater plans. The 50-year for clearance at bridge crossings and culvert crossings, according to our public water rules. 500-year we'll use for citing critical facilities or communities that have higher standards. So a lot of good reasons for using these other frequencies, but from a regulatory standpoint, we really focus on that 100-year or the 1% annual chance flood. In the more recent updates of the maps, they've started adding a couple more frequencies, the 25-year or the 4%, and something called the 100-year plus. Because when they're calculating that 100-year, there's typically a range, and they pick the median of that range, the middle of that range, but they also are showing what kind of the top of that range is, because that might be something helpful to look at for risk in your community. I've already used a couple of these terms, but they're basically synonymous, the 100-year flood and the 1% annual chance flood. We try to stay away from using the term 100-year flood because people have a tendency to think, I've had my big flood, I'm good for another 100 years. And that's not the way it works. It really, there's the same percentage probability each year of that same flood or a bigger flood happening. And we do want to get away from that 100-year, but we do tend to still use it because it is so common. Another term that we'll be using, especially today, is the base flood elevation. And that's a FEMA term. That's the same as that 100-year flood or the 1% annual chance flood. If you look at Minnesota law, you won't see 1% annual chance or BFE, but you will see the term regional flood, and that's the same thing. If you're talking with lenders or with insurance agents, they tend to talk about the special flood hazard area, that mapped area where flood insurance is mandatory, or the SFHA. And then in general, we refer to it as the high flood risk area. So in the flood insurance study, where we have the detailed studies, there will be a floodway data table for each water course. And this is not a real example in Minnesota. It's from a fake community one, but it'd be the same things that we have in our flood insurance study. You'll have the cross sections, and they start from the lower part of the stream. The downstream end of the stream will be A, and as you go upstream, it'll go up in the alphabet. And then the distance, it'll say how it's measured. And it might be in feet, it might be in miles, and it usually is above the confluence with the downstream resource, or it might be above the county line. But it'll say in the table what it is. There'll be a section here about the floodway, and we'll talk about the floodway a little bit more later. But that's something that engineers are more likely to be using. Our zoning officials don't use this section as much, although they might look at the mean velocity, so the average velocity across the floodway, because there's some types of floodproofing and standards that say you can only use them if it's 5 feet per second or less. So this is a good place to see what the velocities are in that part of the floodplain and see if that's an option you can allow for a particular site. The area that our zoning folks and permit folks will use the most is over here on the right. We've got the regulatory column without floodway, with floodway, and increase, and I'll be getting into a little bit more about what those mean in a few slides. Other main thing to be aware of for detailed studies is there will be a profile in the back of the flood insurance study, and there might be several pages for a certain water course. So it'll have the distances noted at the bottom and where the cross sections are. It'll also have roads and culverts, and usually the bottom is the bottom of the roadway, the road crossing, and the top will be the driving surface. This would be the lowest horizontal on that bridge or culvert where you can get through that culvert or bridge. And then note that it's got all the different frequencies here, and it'll have the stream bottom, the thalweg there. It'll have the 10-year, 50, 100, 500. Again, for regulatory purposes, we're using that 100-year, but there's a lot of other good reasons that we want to find that 10-year, 50, or 500-year. Again, those first set of detailed maps, they had two sets of maps. They had the flood insurance rate map where they showed the dark shaded areas here were the zone A's, the high risk areas. And those first ones had a number. That number was the number of half feet between the 10-year and the 100-year. So this 8 means that there was basically 3.5 to 4 feet between the 10-year and the 100-year for this location. And then zone B, there's not a very wide one in this case, but it's a lighter gray, and that usually is the 500-year floodplain, but that medium risk area can also be the 100-year, a foot or less depth, or the 100-year draining less than a square mile, or where there's been an accredited flood control project or levee where they've built a flood control project that's protecting that area. And on the old maps, they called that Zone B. And then the areas that were not shaded in any way were the lowest risk areas, and they were called Zone C on these older maps. Now, those older maps had a second set of maps that they showed the floodway. And we'll talk again more about floodway, but on these old maps, they showed the floodway, and this is where they showed the cross sections that I was just showing that are in the flood insurance study. Problem with these maps, though, was that a lot of the maps look very similar, so people didn't realize they had different data on the two sets of maps, and they'd say, well, I don't need two maps, I'm throwing one of these away, and not realize that there was different information on the two maps. The other problem was that the white area here for the floodway was the same as the no risk area, and some communities would look at that and say, oh, it's white, there's no risk, I can let them do whatever they want, when that was actually the area where we restrict uses the most. So the next set of maps came out after about 1988, and they're still paper. We're still using the dark shaded area for that higher risk zone, the Zone A, but they don't use the numbers anymore because they found that the insurance agents weren't using those numbers to calculate the premiums, so they just put an E for elevation, that there's an elevation that's been determined as shown on the map. The medium risk zone is now called Zone X, a shaded Zone X. It's still that light gray. And then it was called Zone X unshaded because the people who were looking at whether flood insurance was mandatory wanted to just say, it's in Zone A, or it's out of Zone A, it's in Zone X, and I don't have to require flood insurance. They didn't want to have A, B, and C. They just wanted A and Zone X. Then our third generation came around in the 90s. We started having digital products, and there were many advantages. Just being digital was great and a big improvement. Also, it became countywide. In the paper maps, you would have separate maps for each of the cities and for the county. And then when you get to a community, it would say area not included. And it also would get messy when you had annexations. So now our maps, starting in the mid-90s, are countywide. And here, when do we learn how to refold maps? Well, luckily, in more and more of our counties, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And in general, younger people don't know how to use maps. They're dependent on their phones. But back to the progression in our maps, the digital maps, when you look at those, they'll have that aerial photo background, which makes it much more user-friendly, and it can get updated over time. The color changed to a light blue on the maps, and the floodway is, instead of being just crosshatch lines, it's got the blue and the red. The medium risk areas are this kind of brownish orange color, and the low flood risk areas, the unshaded X, is still no shading. So here's the red floodway and the flood fringe. Moving on, though, with our first set of digital maps, they weren't necessarily the best quality. In many cases, they did what we call digital capture. They just took what was on the old paper maps, they took that shape and put it into the new digital map. And in this example, you can see this was on the old paper maps. Exactly that same shape went into the digital maps. When you lay that over the elevation contours, you can see it's not following the ground elevations. But as we went forward in the mapping process, they started using the LiDAR to draw those boundaries and to do updating of the supporting data. And here's something my counterpart in Kansas had, a little bit of humor here about the ad for Rolaids on some of their maps, because some of those first maps, those earlier maps, really were a pain to deal with. The different zones I've already mentioned, the AE, or A with numbers. that those are detailed study areas. There's also called the AO and AH. AO is more of an overland flow situation. AH kind of ponded areas. Zone A is where it's the high risk zone, but there's not a detailed study. And we'll talk about that a little bit more and how we're getting better data to support those zones. In Minnesota, we now have our first coastal zones or V zones on the Lake Superior. So they're on the St. Louis County preliminary maps. And we do have something called Zone D where it wasn't studied. They don't know what the risk is. And usually they'll say it's Zone D for a panel, a full panel of one of FEMA's panels. We do have those still in Olmsted, Itasca, St. Louis, and Wright County, although Wright, they'll be going away when they get their new maps in June. So to get a feel for where we've got detailed versus A zone in the state, the detailed is mainly along the main rivers and in the metro areas, and along the Red River we've got more because we've got more flooding risk. But unfortunately in most of the state we had A zones where we didn't have much supporting data, at least not until more recent years. Then with the most recent maps, starting about 2010, they're still digital, they're one map countywide, but we are using that LIDAR, that better elevation data for doing A zone modeling, supporting modeling, and for drawing the boundaries. Starting with those more recent efforts, we have supporting information, or we should have supporting information for all those A zones, even though it won't be on the official FEMA maps. Only the detailed study information will be on the official FEMA maps. And I mentioned the added frequencies, and Mary will mention some of the non-regulatory products. So this is LIDAR. Plane goes along, shoots down light. They know how the speed of light, and they can calculate the ground elevations and get some really nice information. They're also working on getting updated LIDAR. If you want to know more about that, you can go to this data acquisition workgroup site. But here's a map showing where there's some collections going on. It does take a while to process the data, so we don't have this information on our MinTopo site, a public site where we have the LIDAR information yet, but it is in progress, which is great. Most of our statewide LIDAR was in the 2009, 10, 11, 10 range. So it's over a decade old in pretty much the whole state. So think about what kind of map you guys have, and you might even just throw into the chat what kind of map you have, whether you've got the really old flood hazard boundary map, if you've got the 2-map format, the 1-map paper, or if you've got a digital map. But I'll let people, and I'm not seeing anything showing up in the chat. There, I'm getting a few. Oh, lots of Ds, lots of D firms. Well, that's good. So those folks are dealing with some better products in general. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about some of the key definitions. I've hinted at some of these already. When the first maps were coming out and FEMA was looking, or their precursor was looking at how are we going to map this? People recognized from the beginning that there's different levels of risk right next to the stream where you got high velocities, maybe deep depths, versus someone who's maybe in a backwater area or on the edge of a big river system. So they came up with a concept that we're going to divide out that area where we've got the higher velocities, we've got the greater risk during floods. We're going to call that the floodway. And that's the area that we're going to require that it be left open for the flood flows. And we're going to allow this flood fringe area to be where people develop and where we fill. So the engineers would run a model, see what the flood elevation was before we considered filling in this flood fringe area. And that's the base flood elevation. And in some places, it was pretty easy to see where they should make that boundary, like here where there was a road and you know that there's not much velocity on the other side. There'll be culverts, so there'll be backwater from this river that's going through here. But they could call this area flood fringe and know that filling in here wouldn't make a big difference on the capacity. And then communities want to look at, well, where's our current development? Where do we expect our future development to be? And they would draw a boundary there based on their plans for development. And then they'd have the engineers rerun, pretending these flood fringe areas were all filled in. They would simulate that they were encroached with fill. They were all filled in. And as you fill in that floodplain, it does mean that the remaining part of the floodplain, that it will be higher. The national standard is it can't be increased more than a foot. And in Minnesota, right from the beginning, we said it couldn't be raised by more than half a foot. And there can't be any increase in flood damage potential. So we interpret that as it's impacting existing buildings. So if any existing buildings are already there in the floodplain or right next to the floodplain, you can't cause any increase. But in those more rural areas, areas that didn't have a lot of development, you had a little bit of flexibility. You could allow up to that half a foot of rise. We are seeing many more of the unsteady and 2D models. We won't get into that today. It does get more complicated, and the FEMA guidance is evolving, and there have been some interesting presentations by FEMA and other folks on the 2D modeling in past years. So one other key definition that we look at is what's the lowest floor requirement. Nationally, the lowest floor of any new buildings or substantially improved or damaged buildings is it has to have the lowest floor at the base flood elevation. And then in Minnesota, right from the beginning, we said, well, that's really not enough. We said it's legal to cause up to half a foot of increase by allowing filling in that flood fringe area. We're going to add in that increase because that's the real flood elevation, is what it is after you take that filling into account. And we have a foot of freeboard. So that's our regulatory flood protection elevation, and that will be what your low floor requirement is. So again, we're using these maps and the newer maps when we're looking at those regulations and where the floodway versus flood fringe is. Now, again, many parts of the state, we just have A zones. More and more of them, we have the supporting data. It wasn't done to the rigor of detailed studies, so FEMA won't show these elevations on the map, the official map, but we do have these available as shapefiles that you can get at MinGeo Commons, and we have them on a viewer we'll talk about called the Lake and Flood Elevations Online. We say here where we don't know the floodway, just go ahead and add half a foot, the maximum stage increase, plus your 1 foot of freeboard to get your regulatory flood protection elevation. And from a zoning perspective, they just have to stay out of that area. If they want to build something in that area, they need to get an engineer to figure out where the floodway is.
Seal, if I can interrupt, quick question
Sure.
in the chat. They ask, where does ag field drainage enter into this? Not filling, but adding to the flood height.
Boy, that's really not considered, because when they're looking at the flows for the modeling, they're looking at bigger scale. They're not taking into account ag drainage, and that's a whole separate discussion. We could get into very long discussion about how that should be considered, and they're trying to figure out some ways to consider the impacts of ag drainage. Back to our model-backed A zones, or we'll call them the pink lines, because in our maps, the default color is this bright pink. Again, it's treated as floodway unless someone does an analysis. In our Dealing with A Zones class on March 6th, we'll talk about a few other techniques you can use short of actual modeling. And we're also looking at having some HEC-RAS training in the future, open to others for looking at some of these different things in the models. One other thing to mention is that in the newer maps, we're using the 88 datum. It's kind of like going, the old one was 1929 datum, and we're not, in many cases, the flood elevations didn't change, but maybe the datum did. So it'd be like referencing temperatures in Fahrenheit versus Celsius. We didn't change that temperature. We're using a different reference point. And in the southeast part of the state, it's basically the same. But you get up into the northwest, where glaciers left the state more recently, and you're getting that rebound The land is literally still coming back up relative to the mean sea level. And so land has come up and is a little bit higher. We've got a 1.4 foot difference up here. So it's really important to look at what datum you're in, the further north and west you go in the state. And again, you're not changing the elevation, you're using different reference points. So this might be another way to help people understand that difference. So if you have a survey in one datum and the data is in a different datum, you've got to figure out what the conversion is. If they're in the same datum, that is much easier. And there will usually be an averaged conversion factor in the flood insurance study. So a few things about the resources we have available. If you're looking for a base flood elevation and it's a detailed study area, make sure you look in the flood insurance study. And some of the firms will have on the maps, it will have it to the 10th of a foot, but a lot of the maps, they've just rounded numbers to the nearest foot. So you want to be looking at where it is along that stream or see to the nearest 10th of a foot in the flood insurance study. And we have separate trainings where we get into more detail on how to determine those BFEs and read the flood insurance study to figure those out. For A zones where they've got some preliminary detailed study, that can be used as best available data once the preliminaries are out. And then for the A zones, we've got a lot more information available now than we did certainly more than 10 years ago. Our pink lines, and we might have data at the watershed or community level, or DNR might have some draft data that can be used. So you can check with DNR if there's not pink lines available on our public sites. And to look at the FEMA maps, you can go to the Map Service Center. You put in the address here in this location. And a lot of times the site, it's at like a mailbox. So you might want to click on the building you're actually interested in to get that location drop to have that site you're interested in being the center. And then if you want to print a copy of the map, you go to this little magnifying glass above the viewer here and click on that. It will make this nice format, and it has the, actually this is an old version now, it's got the legend below, but it will only print it at the scale of the FEMA official maps. So if you want it at a different scale, you want to zoom in or out, you could do it on this interactive map before you ask for the official format, and you could do a screen print. And on our website, if you go to our maps and technical resources, we have links to a lot of great information. This map we keep up to date with the status of counties, whether they've got DFIRMs or paper maps. The asterisks mean that they've got a preliminary map. The circles mean there's some data development in progress. To learn how to use the FEMA Map Service Center site, we've got something called our Is My House in the Floodplain video. And if you hit the show more, it will give you time links if you want to just go see, oh, I just want to see how to print a digital map. You can go right to that part of the video. We have some other resources on our county data map viewer site. Sometimes we'll have draft data viewers, like in this example that Wattenwad had in the past. But another great resource I want to mention is our lake and flood elevations online viewer. And initially in like 2020, when we developed this site, we just had lake information, basin information, and then in 21, we added the pink lines here that we had mentioned. If you go into the layers, you'll see, we call this the estimated 1% water surface elevations. We didn't want to call them base flood elevations because they're not officially base flood elevations, but they are the best available data and can be used as your best available data for base flood elevations at these locations. And then if it's a DFIRM county FEMA digital map, we tried to use the same symbology on our map that FEMA uses on the Map Service Center and on their maps. But if it's a county with paper maps and we had a digital layer, not all of them did, but we call those our unmodernized layer. So if we had that, that is shown in LFEO. The other thing in LFEO I want to point out is that we do have a parcel layer you can turn on. If you this little eye thing, it'll have a cross through it, a line through it. When it's off, you click on that and you can turn that layer on and see parcels. If you zoom in another level, it'll show PIDs. And another layer that is helpful is our public water layer. You can see our public water basins and water courses. And again, these are not on in the default, but you can turn them on. And all the layers you can choose to turn off if you're in a spot where things are just too busy. I've got too many 2-foot contours. It just I can't see the details I need to, so you can turn some of those things off. And here's just a summary of some of these useful websites that we talked about. A few of them, but others we didn't talk about in today's presentation. We do talk about them in another recording we've got of some of the useful websites that's on our website. And I think that's what this is. Useful websites training. We get into using all of these sites. So Mary's going to take over at this point.
Yeah, so just getting into the map update. So Seal gave a nice summary of the kind of the history of floodplain mapping. And part of that process was called map modernization. So this was a 5-year effort in the early 2000s to modernize flood insurance rate maps and make them digital for the majority of the population in Minnesota. And this project was done on a countywide basis, but there wasn't a lot of upfront scoping or coordination with the communities. So Risk Map, which stands for Risk Mapping, Assessment, and Planning, is FEMA's newer approach. And here they use a collaborative approach at a watershed scale to improve public awareness of flood risk and provide quality data. So a process called discovery is really the start of the Risk Map process. It focuses on partnering with other federal agencies, state and local communities, and non-governmental stakeholders to determine the mapping needs in a community. Discovery can also lead to identifying mitigation planning technical assistance projects or other mitigation needs, as well as increasing of visibility of flood risk information, education, and involvement. So discovery has been completed for several of the HUC 8. HUC 8 is just a hydrologic unit code. It's just a different size, one of the larger size watersheds in Minnesota. And once discovery is completed, data development for new FEMA mapping may be funded based on needs identified from stakeholders. And it actually has been funded for several counties following discovery. So I'll now go into a little bit more detail on the Minnesota discovery projects. So our closed discovery projects include the Zumbro River watershed, which was completed in 2017, and that includes portions of Dodge, Wabasha, Goodhue, Olmsted, and Rice counties. We also had the Prairie Willow and St. Louis River watersheds, which were completed in 2016, and that included portions of Aiken, Carlton, Itasca, and St. Louis counties. And lastly, we had the Twin Cities watershed discovery, which was completed in 2014. And I'll go into that in a little bit more information on the next slide. So our current or recently completed discovery projects include the Rum River, Ottertail River, Lower Minnesota River West, and Snake River watersheds. And I'll talk about these more in just a minute. So after discovery was completed in 2014 for the Twin Cities watershed, we actually were funded from FEMA to start a data development project for new mapping. And this process is currently underway. Once the data development is completed, funding will hopefully be secured from FEMA to complete the rest of the mapping process, which includes the creation of those digital flood insurance rate maps. And if any of the communities or callers on the training today have any specific questions about this, they can contact Jeff Weiss, whose email address is listed on the slide there. So the Ottertail River HUC 8 covers portions of Becker, Clay, Clearwater, Mahnomen, Ottertail, and Wilkin counties, as well as portions of the White Earth Tribal Reservation. And as part of this project, we also did estimated base flood elevations for around 130 lakes. And we also did some scoping base level engineering modeling. Base level engineering, or BLE, is a more automated and cost-effective engineering approach, which provides communities with a baseline understanding of their flood hazards. And it also provides a good starting point if a risk map project is then funded later for data development by FEMA. And these estimated base flood elevations can likely be used in the A zones as best available data. So it's a nice bonus as well. So this project was finalized in July of 2023, and based on this project, future data development projects hopefully will be funded by FEMA at a later date. So another one that we recently did was the Rum River Huck Gate. This is located in portions of Aiken, Anoka, Benton, Chisago, Crow Wing, Isanti, Kanabec, Mille Lacs, Morrison, and Sherburne counties, as well as portions of the Mille Lacs Band tribal reservation. So as part of this project, again, we did some of that scoping base level engineering modeling. And again, these can likely be used in A zone areas as best available data. So folks, if they're interested in that, they can get in touch with us to get more information on that. And this project was finalized in July of 23, and we're hoping to acquire funding soon for data development projects in Anoka and Isanti based on the information that we found during the Discovery Project. So our current projects, we're currently working on Discovery in the Snake River watershed, which includes portions of Kanabec, Aiken, Isanti, Mille Lacs, Pine, and Chisago counties. And as part of this, we're doing some of that scoping BLE modeling in Kanabec and Isanti counties. And we will be holding the final Discovery meeting here in the next few months. And lastly, the Discovery in the Lower Minnesota River West watershed, which includes portions of Sibley, McLeod, Nicollet, and Renville counties. And as part of this, again, we're doing that BLE modeling, and that's in Sibley and Nicollet counties. It's the pink lines here on the map. And this one, we're hoping to finalize this and hold the Discovery meeting in the next couple of months. So in addition to new modeling and mapping, other flood risk products can also possibly be funded if there is a need identified during Discovery. So some of these products include what's called a changes since last firm product. That's the image here on the top right. This highlights where the 1% floodplain has changed. So this is a nice feature. We also have, and actually I should step back and say those are going to be automatic soon. The changes since last firm products are actually going to be automatically created for future projects, so that's nice. The water surface elevation grids, these grids help illustrate the flood elevations at many points instead of just at cross-section locations. So you can have, it's kind of similar to this flood depth grids on the bottom. They'll just be a grid where you actually can click all around and find the elevation at various points instead of just right at the cross-section. So that's a nice one too. The flood depth grids, which is this bottom right picture, these are depth grids showing the depth of flooding at different areas. So these help stakeholders better understand their risk. They highlight the fact that there are areas that experience more than 3 feet of flooding, even in like a 10% annual chance event. So this is a really nice product to have. There's also what's called a 30-year flood grid that's on the left here. This one basically represents the likelihood of flooding at least once in a 30-year period, which is the average mortgage time period for all locations within the extent of the 1% or the 0.2% annual chance floodplains. So I think now I send it back to you, Seal.
So thanks, Mary.
Yep.
And yeah, and if people have questions about specific areas, you can pop them into the chat or ask at the end, and Mary will help us with answering those questions. For the overall process, just to get a feel for the timeline, Mary was talking about our new watershed level, our Huck 8 watershed discovery processes, and the data that we get during those. That's something's relatively recent step in the process, and that runs a couple years, having that kickoff meeting, doing the data development, and then having that flood risk review meeting and the discovery report. But then it's a separate effort to get that data into the official maps that are used for regulatory purposes and for determining whether flood insurance is mandatory. And that is being done at the countywide level. When those are done still, we might do a part of a county when we've got updated data from a watershed that covers a portion of a county, like we just did that in Rice and Olmsted counties here in recent years. But it'll start off with a kickoff, kind of a scoping meeting, talking about what's being done, making sure things are being covered that the communities think are priorities. Takes a couple years to develop the data, and then they issue preliminary new maps. And within a couple months after they issue the preliminary new maps, we have a local official meeting. They call it the CCO meeting, the consultation something officers meeting. I don't remember what that stands for. And then there's usually a public open house that same evening. During COVID, we ended up having to do virtual and having them on different days. But now we're back to the in-person local official meetings for these countywide updates and the in-person open houses the same evening. And then a month or two after that local official meeting and open house, they start the formal 90-day appeal period. They run some things in the Federal Register. They have certain things they need to do for the due process and going through that legal process. And then there's that formal appeal period. And then depending on what kind of appeals come in, this timeline is based on the process. If we don't have a lot of appeals or complications, things go really smoothly. It might be like a 4-year process from kickoff to new maps, but we've got some of our counties where it's been over a decade and there've been different kinds of issues that come up. Once they've been through that appeal period, addressed any appeals, then FEMA sends a letter that they call their letter of final determination to the communities and says, okay, we've been through this process 6 months from the date of this letter, and it's a firm 6-month date. These maps are going to be effective. And during that 6 months, we work with the communities to update their ordinances and adopt those new maps and learn about the kinds of questions they might hear from their citizens and things. So in terms of some actual dates coming up, we've had a lot of counties either just recently get new maps or that have new maps in progress. Many of you will probably realize that these have been in the works and see your counties coming up here. So going from these old paper maps to the newer digital maps. So very exciting for us to see all these counties getting better data. In the near future, we just got confirmation. We really expect LeSueur to come out with their letter of final determination, their 6-month warning letter on the 17th. We still expect Morrison the end of the month. We're waiting on some preliminary new maps that seem to keep getting pushed out. Hopefully Wabasha comes out this month. They've been pushed back a lot. And then those that we expect in the near future, FEMA's contractors do have a contract that ends in April, so we're very hopeful to see Pope, Stevens, Dodge, St. Louis, unless there's issues that come up in the appeal period. We expect those letters of final determinations to be coming out soon. And then other counties that are funded for getting new maps, or at least a preliminary new maps, are Murray, Aiken, and then Rock updates. We do try to keep up this spreadsheet at a county level with what the status is. I tend to update it every couple months when Water Talk newsletters come out. I try and have that updated because we have an update of mapping as a standing article in our newsletter called Water Talk that many of you probably have seen. Overall, smiley faces are showing those that went effective recently or that are scheduled to go effective here by June. And again, I've showed where you can see an update of this map as time goes on. Some other mapping projects that are in the works is our mapping staff started doing what we call better data LOMRs, letters of map revisions, because there were parts of counties or areas where, gee, we've got better data here. We really need to update this part, but we can't. It's a much more expensive, involved process to go through a countywide update. And FEMA does have this letter of map revision process to insert better data. So we've started doing that in this past year. First 2 places we were doing that were in the Windham area and Cottonwood. and in Wilkin and Nashua area. And we've been through the main part of that process and are working on the process with FEMA, getting those LOMRs finalized. And then Rainy River up in Kuchiching area has started the process. It's been evolving, certainly in the 20 years I've been with the floodplain program. It's amazing how much better our maps are today and the better data that we have. Forward.
Can I interrupt
Yep.
you real quickly with a
Sure.
question we've got in the chat? They ask, how does dam removal enter into MAP?
Boy,
Probably a LOMIC type question, probably.
that would, yeah, dam removals, well, first of all, if it's in a detailed area, they would need to do a letter of map revision and formally get the map updated with that letter of map revision. And the letter of map revision is basically a formal change to the map, and you kind of drop in that area and clip out the old area, you drop in the new area based on that project that was done. Or as I mentioned, it could be just better data. There wasn't a project and you drop in that better data. So if a dam removal results in changes to the area that is flooded, then that's an area that they should be doing a letter of map revision. And same thing with other projects that change the flood levels. They're supposed to be doing letters of map revisions so that the maps stay more accurate. And anything that involves an increase in the flood levels, they have to do a conditional letter of map revision. If there's going to be an increase at all, 0.01 even feet, they have to do a conditional letter of map revision in a detailed study area. So if you want to know more specifics, we can get into that at the end or in a side conversation. But I do want to leave time to talk about map appeals and amendments, and I should have changed that title. I mentioned that 90-day appeal period, that formal appeal period, and we want to be very clear that this is a different process. So we really should be calling this map zone changes and amendments. And this is a quick overview. We're not going to, well, I just talked about LOMRs a little bit, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the smaller scale things. And we do have a recording that we get into more detail from February of 22 that's available on our website. And we are just finishing up a series of like 10-minute videos. There's like 6 of them on the different parts of what I'm going to be blowing through kind of quickly here today. We have this building here, and in this case, you can see the boundary of the parcel is not touching the floodplain. But sometimes when lenders are checking all of their loans, they might put a buffer and their buffer might catch the floodplain. They might tell that person, oh, you're required to get flood insurance. But the flood insurance requirement's only if the building is in or touching the floodplain. So in this case, we would look at providing a better map to that lender and saying, no, that building's not in there. It's not mandatory flood insurance. But a lot of times we will have floodplain that is on the parcel, like in this example, but not touching the building. And this one often will get flagged by that lender because they'll take the parcels, overlay them on the floodplain and send letters if there's an intersection at all, and not have a person look at where the building actually is. So again, that's a situation where we'll recommend that they send a better map and show the building's actually out. But this example, yeah, most of the building's out, but there are pieces that are touching the building, and that lender, if they've got a federally backed loan, that lender must require flood insurance if any part of that building is in or touching the floodplain. They can't say, well, I know it's high. They must require the flood insurance unless folks go through this letter of map amendment process. So again, if it's clearly out, you just send a better map. But we're going to be focusing on the letters of map amendments and something called a letter of map revision based on fill. And these, they're different from those letters of map revisions I was talking about, where they cut out the old part of the map and insert a new updated map. These are not actually changing the map. They're just a document that shows that based on better survey information or better elevation information, or in this case, a better map, that they're really not in the floodplain. So here's one is a good example where you would send the map to the lender. If they don't accept it, if they say, well, I want something from FEMA, then you apply to FEMA for a LOMA, but you don't have to submit any survey information. You just work with the map. And in this example, the building is out. It's near the 500 year, but the mandatory flood insurance only applies to the A zone, to the 100-year zone. So in this case, they would just have to use the map. And here's an example of the fermet. And this is an example where the official fermet, you can see clearly that that building is not in the high risk zone. And sometimes you might supplement some better aerial photos that you've got on local sites. A lot of times you've got much better aerial photos than what's on the FEMA firm. But again, this one that it's touching, they can't just show a better map. They have to get what's called that letter of map amendment. So the letter of map amendment process is for where it's a naturally high area. And FEMA maps, especially earlier maps, they didn't have LiDAR data, and they're not out there surveying everybody's yard and figuring out exactly where that line is. They're pretty darn good where they've used the LiDAR for boundaries, but they're not perfect. So FEMA's got the process that if you submit better elevation data, you get a document showing that you're officially out. So here they look at that lowest adjacent grade, the lowest natural ground touching the building. Natural ground is whatever the ground elevation was on the date of the first map in that area. So filling in the 40s or 50s counts as natural ground because that was what was there when the first map came out. And is that above the base flood elevation? If it is, you can get the letter map amendment. Even if it's got a basement, they might have higher risk, but if they were built legally before the first maps came out and before we had the regulations starting in the 1970s, then they could get a letter of map amendment for this situation. One thing that complicates folks is that attached decks or stairs, they will look at what's the lowest adjacent grade of that deck. And in addition to looking at the lowest adjacent grade of the building. And if that attached deck is low, they cannot get a letter of map amendment. They can go and put in additional supports, detach it, and have a really close nearby deck, and then get the survey done again and show that they have the lowest adjacent grade high enough and get a LOMA. And we know people have done that in some situations. But they worry about those decks because when floods do come, the decks fall, they rip off part of the building, you have a lot of damage. Or another thing that happens sometime is, in this example, you can see the BFE contour was going along here. These folks had to have a walkout. They dug themselves into the floodplain. They can't go and quick put a berm and say, oh, never mind. Now they're in the floodplain, and they won't be able to get a LOMA in that case. So if they are in, see if they've got an existing letter of map amendment or letter of map revision based on fill already. And otherwise, see if the community has records. If it's a more recent building, they should have gotten as-built elevations as the part of their administration of the floodplain regulations. And otherwise, they might need to get a survey done. We do have situations where they're really high. And so FEMA does allow a map that's either done by the local official, or another example that I'll be showing here, where if the contour that's completely below the building, not touching the building, is at least a foot above the base flood elevation, you can just use this map with these 2-foot contours. You don't need a survey. Here's an example using our lake and flood elevations online. We're printing a map. Here's our example site. We might need to do 2 maps to show the cross sections and where the base flood elevation is. This map was zoomed in enough to see the building a little easier. But then in the comments, what we do is we we give the address and we call it the LIDAR lag, the LIDAR lowest adjacent grade. We look at that contour that doesn't go through the building. In this example, it's 1128. We subtract that foot, and FEMA uses this terminology. The LIDAR lag is going to be that 1127. We show what the base flood elevation is. In this example, we had a separate printout showing the upstream, downstream cross sections, and knew what the flood elevation was based on our pink lines. If you don't have that data already, you might look at our min topo. If you use the elevation icon here, you can get point elevations, kind of click around the building, see what the lowest is, see if you pay a surveyor to go out there and get that elevation certificate, if you're likely to get a LOMA. But even if you can't get a LOMA, usually an elevation certificate will get you cheaper flood insurance. You can apply with a paper application. If it's a single lot, FEMA's got the MTEZ form. If it's for multiple lots or a letter of map revision based on fill, you have to use the MT1 form. You can do it online. You supply the same items, but digitally. And surveyors and professional engineers can get qualified to do an e-LOMA, an electronic LOMA. First one's audited and then randomly, but they can get those in potentially less than a day, but it's much quicker than the average 35-day period it would be for the online or paper letter map amendment. And you can get refunds after a LOMA it won't be at the full amount because there's some fees that don't get refunded, but most of the premium can get refunded. So if someone's told they need flood insurance within 45 days, we tell them get that policy and get your LOMA, and you should be able to get at least a partial refund. And I see I'm at the end of the hour, so I'll just quickly mention LOMR-Fs is when the map was correct. It's a low area, but they built on fill. They met your ordinance where the lowest floor is at the regulatory flood protection elevation, so it's high. Their lowest adjacent grades above the base flood elevation. They can get this letter of map revision based on fill. The difference when you apply is that there's a fee of $425 for FEMA to review it, whereas a LOMA, it's a free process for the review. They have to show the lowest adjacent grades above the base flood elevation, and the lowest floor is above the base flood elevation. And it involves the community filling out a community acknowledgement form. And when you're filling that out, you're saying they didn't do filling in the floodway. If it's a conditional letter of map revision based on fill, that it complies with the Endangered Species Act and attaches those items, and that it's meeting the local regulations. That's how you're showing it's reasonably safe from flooding. See your community. There's some cases where there's something called Technical Bulletin 10 that gives some other options. If you want to know about that, you can reach out. But that currently is only an option in St. Paul, Stillwater, and a couple other communities. It continues to need to meet your floodplain and shoreland regulations, but it does take away the mandatory flood insurance requirement. So we call it a flood insurance waiver is really what it is. So sorry, I went a couple minutes over, but let's open it up. And I can see Gary was answering some questions in chat as we went. Gary, were there any questions in chat that we didn't get to?
Well, I think you did a better job of explaining one of the questions than I did in the chat, but yeah, asking about elevation certificates and how they work and where they can be used. And I think you explained most of that in your presentation.
Yeah, the elevation certificate is it's used to document that they were built properly, that the lowest floor and adjacent grade and all those things were meeting the local ordinance. But it used to be required for if you were in the high risk zone and applying for flood insurance, those in the high risk zones had to submit an elevation certificate to get rated for their flood insurance. Now you can choose to submit that to get a better rate, and that information's also in the elevation certificate. You're required to have those if you're a community rating system community. So like in Moorhead or Austin or Mower County or St. Louis Park or Golden Valley, our CRS communities, they're required to have those on file. And you can use the data in the elevation certificate for that LOMA, because you don't need all the information in there, but that's one of the sources you can use to apply for the LOMA or the LOMR-F. And I forgot to mention at the beginning of the hour that we will send a PDF of our slides to everyone who attended, and actually we'll send it to everyone who registered for the training today. So that is what I had in my presentation. So thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody.